Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of Little Tiny Lunch Nuggets of Tech and Telecom. Incredibly very happy, if that's even a term, to welcome our newest guest. But first, I wanted to explain why there is just one of me, as in one half of the photos you all have seen in the invitation. And my colleague and partner in crime for this, Jen Fritchie, is unfortunately at a last minute is up to her eyeballs in some very exciting things involving Spectrum. So without further ado or more details, she is unable to join us at the beginning of today's session, but I hope she might be able to jump in at some point before we are done. So, before we delve into what I think is going to be a fascinating conversation with a lot of implications for some of the broadband and spectrum related policy discussions going around the Beltway, first and foremost, I wanted to say thank you to our guest, Mr. Jefferson Wang from Accenture. And Jefferson, I would love for you to give our guests a quick overview of who you are and how you came to write this book, which is absolutely fascinating. And the book I am talking about is The 5G Home in a Hyper-Connected World, although I don't think the second part is part of your actual title. All right, Jefferson, please give us some background and how is it that you came to write this?
I would first like to say thank you guys so much for having me. Really excited to be here and long time fan of Georgetown since my sister went to Georgetown. So happy to be here. Just background on myself, as Carolyn had mentioned, uh, 21 plus years or more in wireless. I think I lost track. I started in the 2G days. So I was a mechanical engineer up the street at University of Maryland. And part of my initial focus was working on devices. So back in the 2G days, if you can recall, it was really, we used to call them TNTs, those talk and text devices where you had, your 12-digit keypad and you had to mash the 2 key 3 times to get to the letter C.
Yeah.
But I was building devices. So that was, the modem layer up to the actual protocol stack up to back then, whatever the walled garden was that you were working on. So there was hundreds of operating systems back then, right? It wasn't just kind of 2 primary operating systems. And then that was really kind of the first part of my career, just more of a hardware and mechanical engineering specific industrial design area and wireless. And then in the 3G days, I shifted to a different part of the value chain. I went down to Latin America and I was building out all of the 3G networks across Latin America. So the radio, the actual backhaul and the transport, designing that, figuring out how this is going to work with a core network, how that core network is going to touch a billing system and the operations of that. So that was kind of the next chapter of my career, if you will. And then the next chapter after that was really 4G. So then I came back up to the United States and went to between the United States and Asia and was building a lot of the smartphone, the app ecosystem, and the economy around kind of what an app ecosystem looks like and an app economy looks like. So spent a lot of time in Mountain View, as you can imagine, with early releases of Android. So dealing with kind of what we had evolved to into that rectangular slab on our palm of our hands that we can't take our eyes off of now. And then about 2010, as we kind of crested at the 4G era, I went to start a business. So I went to start a business focused on 5G. Just at that point, I got smart enough to realize like, hey, these Gs are coming every 10 years. I should probably figure out how to optimize this. So we started a company kind of focused on 5G very early on, right? 5 to 10 years earlier than standards were getting developed, but just seeing what it would evolve to. Built that company up and sort of brought in network folks from Ericsson, brought in device people from Motorola, and brought in kind of, folks who had worked at the carrier side who dealt with all the operations. And we kind of started this company with the actual preparation for where we are now. 2017, we sold the company back to Accenture, actually. And part of that was, hey, how do we sort of make the market here? And how do we actually write a book that actually sets the vision of everything we've done for the past 7 or 8 years beforehand? And then that's where we're at now. So now we're starting to realize that.
So you can fondly recall the days where, back at the big conferences in Texas and Florida with CTIA and GSMA, it was always the year of big data. It was going to be the year, forget about big data. It was going to be the year of data.
Yeah,
This was going to be it. And that was, I don't know, hype around 3G.
yeah,
And I'm sure you remember we started hearing the discussion coming out of Asia,
yeah.
Japan in particular, about 4G. And I remember being at conferences here and people, it's just a marketing term. It doesn't really mean anything. And then here we are.
That was iMode coming out of the 3G days, and how would that explode data? Yeah, those are, now look at us. Now look at the industry, look at the world.
So before we get into the core of your thesis here, you have multiple theses. One of the things we often hear here inside the Beltway, and especially at the Georgetown Center, because what we do at the Center for Business and Public Policy is look at issues, sometimes contentious issues between business and public policy. What are those areas of friction? And when you talk about broadband or high tech, I think there are a fair number of folks, not just here inside the Beltway, here in Washington, but in other places around the country, that are fairly suspect
Yeah.
of anything with a G attached to it. Because in their mind, I think if anything involves spectrum and it's not completely fiber based, then it is a less useful, less reliable, or less robust technology. That is not what your book tackles, but I was wondering if you could give your thoughts on that, given that you truly, as we like to say here for the Nugget sessions, are featuring the experts in the field, and given all of your actual experience with systems and the devices, I'd love to get your thoughts on that sort of, I would argue, mythology. I'm an ardent wireless fan and have been forever. But I would love your thoughts on that before we actually talk about the substance of your book.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a many layers to that question. I think answering the question up front, and then I'll kind of dive into the layers, would be that traditionally cellular communications has been a very reliable form of communications, right? These networks that we're on started with voice. Those voice started with really a five nines level of reliability of 99.999% uptime, right? So I mean that, if you do the math, that is a very reliable network. There's probably a piece of awareness that we should just make sure we drive out, that that is different than Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi is a best effort network that is on something called, unlicensed spectrum, and that's a very different type of technology than what your smartphone is working on today, what your flip phone worked on before that. So that's kind of the first piece of it. And when you look at and you dig into how reliable it is and how difficult it is to keep something up 99.999% of the time, you see that there's redundancy built in. You see that there's disaster recovery built in. You see that there's power generators next to the towers in case the power goes out. You see all of these things that are built out. And then you kind of look at how that's migrated into the cloud business that we're in today. Right. And these are two big tectonic trends of technology that are coming together. And that's part of why we actually realize how one time in a lifetime this moment is, right? It's not just a new generation of technology. You've got compute power completely disrupting with cloud coming to edge. You've got cellular changing from a consumer business and consumer focus to industries and enterprises. And when you have two big tectonic shifts like that, there's lots of innovation that we can't imagine today. So one, how reliable is cellular? It is much different than what we're used to from when we think about Wi-Fi. Number two, it's made to be, this type of resilience and reliance, and that's very different than what I think other technologies are made for. If you look at the layers to this, there's spectrum, as you had mentioned, involved. There is how redundant the network is built that is involved, how many service providers are actually monitoring this, and how more important that you mentioned the word data, Carolyn. We're just growing in the amount of data, and data means a lot of things. There's data from us, from usage. There's
Right.
data from the network on how the network is doing. There's data from the device on how that's going. There's data from the apps that's coming off. This massive tidal wave of data now gives us better visibility to figure out how people are using this, how to predict outages, how to try and avoid those things more proactively so they don't happen. That's if we all do our jobs correctly. So it's an incredibly exciting time. I think in the future, what we want is that the general consumer policymakers, they shouldn't worry about this as much. If we actually say that a true use case is you shouldn't have to worry about robust and redundant connectivity, we should be able to figure that out. We just may need the resources to be able to do that. And that may be more spectrum in certain areas, that may be more reliability or right of ways to get to different abilities to put up more small cells from that perspective. So there is this incredible mix of policy and technology that we're seeing come through and accelerate more and more.
Your enthusiasm for this is infectious, and I do want to circle back because, for right or for wrong, right now a lot of focus is on privacy and security, and I know you directly address both of those important issues in your book. But first, let's get to the fun parts, which is I really got a kick out of the various categories of parents that you list in your book and talk about in terms of creating these home environments that will be customized or customizable for the type of family that you are. Can you give our audience a sense of how, how you organized, your concept of home, and then walk us through this fundamental concept you have of being hyper connected and the idea that your home truly, in a fully realized 5G world, doesn't have to be where you get your mail. It can essentially be wherever you are. At least that's my takeaway from the book. And if I got it completely wrong,
You got
let me know.
no, you got it absolutely right, Carolyn. I think that the core thesis of this is that if 5G is going to happen, which it is, right? Like I love these questions like that I get from folks. It's like, well, is 5G going to happen? Like naturally it is. Just like 2G happened after 1G, 3G happened, 4G. Generally, spectrum is a finite resource, as everybody knows. And because of that, a lot of times we have to take those resources and refarm them over, right? So as
Right.
2G networks shut down, took all that spectrum and refarmed it as low band spectrum into 4G or 5G, or how do we reuse that? So naturally, we're going to migrate to 5G because 5G was built from the ground up to help more than just the consumers. All of these new industries actually have this confusion, as you know, Carolyn, from your time at CTIA. Hey, how are you guys going to migrate all these people? This
Right.
isn't new for cellular. We've been doing this for the past
Right.
40 or 50 years, migrating people off old devices, telling them to incent them to pick up the new devices, giving them reasons to come over from a service perspective, shutting it down at the end. Like this is literally nothing new. We've done this for 40 years. So I think it's new from a perspective of other industries, and it may be new to certain consumers who are just getting into technology. So when you take that forward, the thesis is if home becomes more important than ever, and we wrote this book before the pandemic came out.
I was
So
going to ask you if this was an all reaction to, but I don't think it
no,
was possible because it came out before,
yeah,
right?
this was we were doing all the research up until about 2019, and then we went to publishing around 2019. So we wrote this before with the prediction that home is going to be this battleground and more important than ever. That we're going to spend more time in the home, working from home as people started to actually do after the pandemic. People were going to actually spend more time with immersive entertainment as we brought in new technology that stood on 5G. So if 5G is allowing a more responsive network, putting on something that requires that better responsiveness, that lower latency, like a virtual reality solution, and untethering it, does that unlock the metaverse faster? How do we think about healthcare at home? Why are we wasting so much time driving to the appointment, getting out of our car, going up the elevator, checking into the actual doctor, then leaving, coming back, and driving back? That's an incredible amount of time that we don't have. And there's different value chains that we have to unlock for that. But all of these things become this actual data that's generated in the home. So home becomes more than ever. How do we actually abstract that and make your life better? Not to make money off it, but to make your life better, because you're changing the actual business models of the people involved. The old business model of the people involved was, if you sneeze, I'm going to charge you to sneeze. If you want to actually use a fork, I'm going to charge you. It's a very monthly recurring cost business model. If you look at how the ecosystem has to come together, you mentioned privacy and trust. The number one folks that are providing you a service in the house right now that has a very high trust factor is telcos, cable companies, communication service providers. Because during the pandemic, again, we weren't predicting the pandemic, but they alleviated overage charges during the pandemic. They let people off of their bills during the pandemic. They kept actually the world running during the pandemic, and innately their trust factor shot up. Now, this is, a long time to build trust and policy and security, a moment to lose. So it's a very perishable moment that we talk about. But we knew that home was going to be more important. We just didn't know it was going to happen this fast, right? And then when you think about that, if we can actually use the data to make your life better, not to sell the data, but to make your life better, then we can take your home anywhere. And that was really the key, is at home anywhere, right? To first learn about your preferences, to first learn about where you're trying to actually do and go, and then to make your life better anywhere. So that if you are actually now on vacation in a hotel room, it's so frustrating because maybe it's dark and you get into the hotel room late at night. You have no idea where the lights are. You have no idea where any of the switches are, and you're just fumbling around. That shouldn't be the experience. You should feel at home regardless of where you are. If you're at a shared office space that you might change because of cost structures in the future, because real estate may totally change, how do you actually feel at home in that office? How do you make sure your pictures are there? How do you make sure your preferences are there? How do you make sure your temperature, your lighting, all that stuff makes you feel at home regardless? Imagine eventually when you're in a level 4 autonomous vehicle or a level 5 autonomous vehicle, you have a lot of free time now as you commute. How do you make that your virtual living room? How do you make that your virtual office? Because now you have this time while you're in a virtual vehicle. So how do you actually become at home in, inside 4 walls or on 4 wheels is really the concept. But those are kind of these future chapters that we're going for. But it starts with, if we're going to move to a better form of connectivity, home is going to become a gold mine. As home becomes a gold mine, how do we use that data and create the right ecosystem to actually improve your life as you actually move and become more transient and be at home anywhere?
I see that we have been joined by my co-host, Ms. Fritchie. Hello, Jennifer.
Oh, Carolyn. Hi, Jefferson. Thanks for joining us. Sorry to be
Uh,
late to our lunch late.
well,
Well,
you are in a very important spot right now, Jennifer. So please keep the auction going.
we were just getting started, and Jefferson was walking us through some of the foundational theses of his book. And we were reminding our audience that this was published before the pandemic, but how unbelievably relevant it is to what our individual lives have become over the last 2 years. Um, Let me ask you a quick question, and it is related to something you just raised, Jefferson, as well as in your book, and this idea of hyperconnectivity. Talk to us about what that looks like. Well, actually, not so much what it looks like, but in that scenario, technologically, what sort of network capability are you looking at, and what sort of device capability are you looking at? And I assume here the
Yep.
devices you're talking about are not just our smartphones. It's a whole host of other devices that have been enabled with wireless or other connectivity to the net and to the cloud. But let me stop there and just let you explore that for us a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we'll probably nerd out for a little bit here, but
You
there's
can always nerd out with us.
yeah.
No offense to anyone else. Jennifer and I are very proud little nugget nerds.
Oh,
That's
I know.
fine.
Jennifer and I used to we go back and forth on fun topics on technology all the time. Um, if you actually look at the details, there is quite a bit of importance in the details, and I think that that's important to keep in mind, that the general consensus on the consumers may not worry as much about this, but things just happen, and we sometimes take that for granted. I'll give you a story. Like when I was building smartphones, there was a point where the hype got so far. It was like you had to make a smartphone that like made you breakfast for anybody to maybe say, that's kind of cool. You just expected that when you launched, it's like, meh, seen it before, done it before. It didn't matter how many advances you put in. It didn't matter how many megapixels you could squeeze into a sensor. It didn't matter. No matter what you did, it was like, yeah, seen it. So we got to a maturity level where we actually, basically became like a good enough. So you had to move to these new areas. The reason why I say that is, if you look at your today's, let's just take home as an example. Everybody is involved and they have a situation where they can have an opinion on this. Your home is not a smart home at all. It is barely a connected home. I can guarantee you that you have 10 to 15 different applications running on your smartphone just to work your home. You've got your doorbell, you've got your security system, you've got a Sonos speaker potentially app, you've got the you've got your kitchen, you've got your washer dryer, right? Samsung asks you now to download smart things on your washer dryer. You've got all sorts of these apps. That is not a good experience. And that also means that those silos that are being created on each of those apps are basically not sharing and working together to make your life easier. So to an extent, you've just basically took the app economy off of a smartphone and put it into your home. That's the beginning of it. But when you move to what we need to get to make this just really, really a true word smart, we just call it future because we had to rebrand it. The future is that if we can share the data to make your life better, then we're actually being proactive. I'll give you an example. Today, people actually turn off their automation because it doesn't have all the pieces of data, it doesn't work. So many times a thermostat just thinks that no one's home. It might track the dog moving, but then in the end, if the dog is just sleeping, the heat just goes off and it's just freezing. And you come home, you're like, I need to shut this off because it's making assumptions on an entirely wrong data set.
Right.
That's a big problem. Your vacuum today on your Roomba, which you have another app for, maybe you set it to go off every morning at 7 a.m, but you're sick one day and you just want to get some extra sleep and you called in sick to work, but it goes off at 7 a.m. and how do you be mad at it? It's doing a job, but you're like, I really wish you didn't have to go off at 7 a.m, right? There's no context to any of that. There's no change. It's basically automation, right? That's essentially all it is. It's not context. It's not anything that's predictive. It's literally automation. And it's worse because it's automation in 15 different places.
So how do you bring all of that together in a way? And the only reason I'm maybe jumping over your point, but how do you bring all of those streams together? And I assume most of the sharing by it's different machines, and therefore representative of the different parts of the ecosystem. But how do you pull all of that together in a way that makes people feel comfortable that there aren't folks standing there siphoning off information about them that either they just don't want people to know or would truly compromise financial or health data that is no one has a legal right to know. And how do you do that in a not only just private but in a secure setting? Again, I know you explain this in your book, but I was wondering if you could just touch on that. And then Jennifer, I want you to jump in with some actual business questions. Go ahead, Jefferson.
How do you do that? First is separate security and privacy because people use them synonymously, but they're actually very different, right? Privacy is a policy. Security is like how you actually deal and treat that information. So I think when you separate those out, how you do that is you find somebody who's trusted in the ecosystem, right? Communication service providers, telcos, that's one of them. There's probably others out there that we can explore, but let's use that as an example. Somebody has to orchestrate this. And someone has to actually create a business model where people are incented to join and people are incented to sell, and it's almost a marketplace. And when you do that, you actually provide incentives, or we call them tradable assets, between these groups so that they also want to share their data because it's to the benefit of everybody. So when you look at that model, we call it a two-sided business model, right? Let's say you've got kind of providers, device manufacturers, just people who are trying to sell something over here. And then you've got all these customers over here, and somebody trusted is in the middle. And in that middle, that trusted person is saying, you know what, I'm going to help you sell more of your devices because I'm going to offer you to the right customers. For example, if you have a 1-bedroom apartment in New York City with a door person, we shouldn't offer you a massive security kit because there's one door, there's a door person, but we should offer you home automation or something else that makes your life easier. So instead of just blanket carpet bombing these products, how are we able to actually better offer a solution over to you? Now that creates an economy where there's a natural ability to trade assets, to say, the more we connect you, the more sales we help you drive, the better we help you attach to customers. Potentially this central party now assures the service and says that if the device goes down, we will take the first call. If the device breaks, we'll take it in and we'll send it back to you. If the device has an issue or is out of date, we'll replace it. And that's a tradable asset.
So are you saying that maybe we get the telcos out of the business of customer service?
Exactly.
Sorry, wasn't trying to be snarky there. Jennifer, over to you.
No problem. Jefferson, great to see you. Thank you again for doing this. So you probably know where my line of questioning is going to. This is all a great, concept, but it does take a heavy lift on infrastructure to get there. And there in the pandemic, there's been a huge windfall and interest in my world, in the private equity world, to put capital toward fiber to the home.
Yep.
And I'm curious what you think. Where are we in that process? Can all of this happen, or is it like a chicken and the egg with the infrastructure to come?
It's never a bad thing when the government decides to try and ignite something. And if you look at governments globally, it's not just the US with Biden's infrastructure bill or Rural Digital Opportunity Fund #2 or those things. It's happening in Europe, where there's a 30 X billion-dollar fund there. It's happening in Asia. It's happening in Latin America, where you're starting to see governments realize that they have to get involved in the infrastructure because it's very fragmented and difficult. So when you look at fiber to the home, Jennifer, I would almost say it's also just fiber in general. That dry powder on the sidelines is actually now realizing that a consistent return, right? Private equities are changing, right? Jennifer, as you could give us a thesis on this, of course, but private equities are now, there's a subset that realize that a consistent return and mixing their portfolio companies together for higher value is as interesting as cutting up a company and selling it off in its pieces like traditional private equity was. So we're actually starting to work with lots of private equities that are interested in, hey, I would like to be involved in infrastructure. Potentially there's other funding out there, but private equity is an incredible one. And they are changing their investment thesis to say these single digit returns over longer periods of times with purpose actually become really interesting. The purpose of fixing the digital divide, the purpose of fixing cloud inequity, the purpose of improving people's lives, along with a single digit return, is really interesting to some of these private equities. So that we've seen a big shift in. We never saw that before with dry powder on the sidelines.
No, I would very much agree. And it's not even private equity only, right? I mean, AT&T seems to have woken up somewhat, my words, not yours, but to fiber. Do you think the telcos have the big stodgy guys gotten the memo that fiber is needed?
They've always needed it to have an access for their small cells, their macro towers, and those things like that. There's been in that kind of RAN to transport to backhaul value chain, it's just turned from a T1 line into fiber. So that's always been there. I think the challenge when you look at this has always been fiber is so expensive to dig when you actually have to open the ground up. But when the ground is already open, it's so cheap to lay. Glass is cheap. So finding the right opportunities where a new community is being redeveloped, a new part of a city is being redeveloped, areas where there's new construction, where you can really accelerate out at a really low cost, how to drive out fiber. And if it's dark, where dark fiber is unlit, there is no real electronics on either side to make it work, where you wholesale it, or actually providing a service, lighting it up and providing it to other folks. Both of those become incredibly important. I think it's important globally to look at the fact that geography has a big part to do with this, right? We've always compared ourselves to the US is lowest in speed on this stuff. The US has Montana, okay? That's very different than Japan. Japan is the size, let me give you a scale. I tell my clients all the time, Japan is smaller than California. So to light up a geography like Japan with fiber is very different than lighting up a landmass like the United States. And then you compare it to China. I always have these fun debates. China's government entity can say, you have to provide access and right of ways to these providers. Whereas in the US, we have 3,000 counties that all have different rules and different regulations. So you have to go to 3,000 different entities of a county to do this, right? So it's very different when it comes to government, when it comes to policy, when it comes to geography. And not to say that this is impossible, simply saying that you cannot make apples to apples comparisons on something like speed when the detail of what we talked about goes on. And I feel like it's important to bring that out to everybody, because so many people say oh, well, we should just be like this.
Right.
It's so different when you actually try and do this stuff.
Absolutely.
So we oddly, well, not oddly, I think as predicted, have found ourselves at the end of our technical half hour, and I don't think we've moved beyond the first chapter. Although we
We're at
did
the
touch
end.
on the later parts of the book. All right, so what we'd like to do is identify a nugget or two, right? So, an idea, a concept, a question that our audience should walk away from this really short
Yeah.
discussion. And being I would say, the biggest brain on the screen at the moment, I would defer to you, Jefferson. And whether it's a shout out for your book or something that you are working on, building on what was in your book, what would be the one or two nuggets that you think we should all walk away with, either knowing or wondering, relative to your thesis about the hyper-connected 5G world and how that can really transform this concept of home and really address some of these very clunky parts of the industry and the customer experience?
I would first off, definitely not the smartest brain on this call, but I would say that the biggest, most important thing that I would hope people take away out of this is that network connectivity can be the foundation of innovation. And it's not something to be taken for granted. It is not something to be called a commodity. And it's not something to be viewed as it's just going to be there and evolve. And that's something that I think people, every time you're used to familiar or something, just like smartphones, is like, yeah, big screen, yeah, a lot of memory, yeah, okay, I'm bored. But there's a lot of things happening. And when you build a device, everything happens at the chipset layer first, the silicon first. That's where the camera's exposed. That's where the audio, high fidelity, everything's happening. It's the same thing in the world of transformation. Network connectivity is constantly evolving. And because of that, we'd be remiss to think that that's a commodity that's going to stay the same, that we're going to drive down in cost, because that's constantly changing. And that's something that is really important right now, because as you look at connectivity and compute coming together, those big two tectonic plates, now you're really talking about something we're not going to see for a long time if we miss this boat. So just please remember that if there is no solid network connectivity, cloud does nothing. If there is no solid network innovation on the connectivity side of things, we don't see these new experiences. The next Uber, the next Airbnb is not born. So please remember that, infrastructure, network, and connectivity are constantly evolving. It's difficult, it's hard, but it's definitely the basis for everything we want to do in the future.
Jefferson, and Jen, please jump in here. Would not have even attempted to try to capture, but I think you just did in the most eloquent way. I especially wanted to emphasize for folks listening or watching this, and we will turn this into a podcast. We have some standard intro language, so it will have a long shelf life, and we'll get that over to you. But it's to remind people and make sure that people are sensitive to the fact that we are in a unique moment in time, not because of the pandemic so much, even though that has been an incredibly crazy use case, as it were, right? But because of these changes in the technology and what is possible, and it wasn't possible 10 years ago, it may not be possible 10 years from now, but it seems that we are in a very unique period of time that people need to understand that if we miss this window, much like you said, we may not have it again. Jennifer, over to you for closing comments.
Thank you again. I always learn so much from you, and I constantly have throughout my career. So really appreciate you allowing us some touch points into that great brain of yours, and excited to watch your path from here. So thank you.
Happy to do it. Hope to see everybody soon.
Absolutely, Jefferson. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Jen, great to see you as always.
You too. Bye-bye, everyone.
Talk to you guys soon. Bye.
All the best. Take care, everybody.
Like you. Thank you.